Okay, a brief introduction to Athenian theater and theories of tragedy. When the Athenians went to the theater, it was an all day affair. Part of a religious festival actually lasted for several days. Each day there would view three tragedies, um, interconnected, so they formed a trilogy like the Oresteia, with a series of three plays that are tied together. A comedy and a satyr play. A satyr play is like a slapstick, um, if you've heard of the Three Stooges kind of thing. Um, they actually preferred the tragedies. The stories were came from Greek legend and mythology, so everybody already knows the main storyline. Okay, my example of that is getting kind of old now, but if you've seen the movie Titanic, hopefully you were not surprised when the ship sank, because that is a very famous story um, that's now been around over a century, of this great ocean liner, supposedly unsinkable, that hit an iceberg and sank with terrible loss of life on its first trip across the Atlantic. So the audience already knows the story. They go to hear what the playwright does with it. Something that's true of Shakespeare's theater was also true of the ancient Greek theater. The costumes and scenery were pretty basic by our standards today. Certainly nothing like a movie. And so the language in Shakespeare's time and also in ancient Greece, you didn't go to see a play, you went to hear a play. The emphasis was on the language, the poetry, and the way that the playwright handles the plot. It was a very intellectual kind of exercise, actually, fitting in with the rationalism of the time. Now, I've given you two tragedies to read over the next couple lessons, both by Sophocles, Oedipus the King and Antigone. And what I'm going to ask you to think about in those is to think about two theories of what makes for tragedy. The first comes from the philosopher Aristotle. And Aristotle says tragedy is when we witness the downfall of a good man. As good as you are, maybe a little bit better. Certainly not perfect. Who's perfect, right? But a good man. Has to be a good man in order for us to feel his downfall is tragic. Because we're going to see him suffer. If we see a bad person suffer, we don't call that tragic. We call that justice, right? And his downfall has to be caused by an intellectual error, a mistake in judgment. The word he uses is hamartia, which is one of the words used actually for sin in the New Testament. But it has a very specific meaning. It is to miss the mark, to fall short. It's derived actually from archery, where you're shooting the arrow at the target, but you come up a little bit short. You don't quite get there. It's an intellectual error, a mistake in judgment in Aristotle's view, not a moral failing. Okay? The idea of a tragic flaw, that's Shakespearean tragedy, not Greek. In Aristotle's theory, the good man is destroyed because he makes an intellectual error, a mistake in judgment. And as a result of us seeing him make this mistake and it lead to his downfall, we feel the two emotions of pity and fear. Pity because he really doesn't deserve his fate, and fear, if it happened to him, it could happen to me. Okay? There's a saying in baseball, nobody bats 1,000. Okay? Batting 1,000 would mean you got a base hit every time you came to bat. That ain't happening. Not even in this year's shortened season. Okay? Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody does or says things from time to time that we look back on and go, why in the world did I do that? Okay? Most of the time it doesn't destroy us the way we see in a tragedy. But that's why we feel both pity and fear. And Aristotle says, as a result of witnessing this and feeling these things, we gain an intellectual insight. We learn something about the human condition, about life. We take away a lesson that helps to make us better people, more thoughtful, more conscientious in the way that we go about living. For Aristotle, tragedy is something that is part of our kind of moral education. Now, that's one theory of what makes for tragedy coming out of ancient Greece. The other theory is, I don't have a person's name to put on it. It's called the moral theory. In it, the protagonist, the main character, is brought down and caused to suffer by a moral failing. And it's always the same one. It is hubris. Hubris is excessive, stubborn pride. He gets the big head, thinks too highly of himself, and he won't listen to anybody. And as a result, he commits an ate, an act of senseless violence. He goes too far and does something that he ought to know better than to do. And as a result, he brings about nemesis, destruction. He goes too far because he thinks too highly of himself. And he destroys himself. And frequently those around him. I mean, after all, are we the only persons affected by what we do to ourselves? If you ruin your life, are you the only one hurt? Aren't people who love you and care about you also hurt? Now, I'm going to ask you to think, in the case of Antigone and also Oedipus, about which of these theories do you think each best fits each of those plays. And I want to heads up, there's no right answer. Intelligent critics disagree. Okay, so you're not graded based on whether or not you give the right answer. There is no right answer. What I'm looking at is how well you support your interpretation by evidence drawn from the play. Okay? You got to show me that you read the play carefully, quote lines from it to back up your interpretation. Why do you think this is a good person who makes a mistake, or is he the main character destroyed by hubris, excessive, stubborn pride?